It was dawn over a shattered ridge. The concrete bunkers of southern Okinawa stood silent under the smoke, black silhouettes against a rising orange sun. The rain of naval shells had stopped. Only the wind carried the smell of fuel and dust. A small group of U.S. Marines crouched behind a ridge of blasted coral. One man carried something the enemy had once mocked, a cumbersome steel tank strapped to his back, two nozzles glinting in the early light. Inside the nearest bunker, Japanese defenders waited in silence. They had survived artillery. They had survived machine gun fire. But now, a different sound approached, the hiss of ignited gasoline under pressure. The Marine stepped forward. A burst of liquid fire swept across the opening. In a heartbeat, the bunker became a furnace. Flames roared inside, crawling over concrete and men alike. Across the war's many fronts, the same horror played out, from Normandy, pillboxes to the volcanic caves of the Pacific. The toy weapon that soldiers once laughed at had become a machine of absolute terror, and its arrival would change not only the battlefield, but the very psychology of war itself. In the early years of the Second World War, the world's attention was fixed on steel and speed. Tanks rolled across Europe. Dive bombers screamed through the skies. Artillery dominated doctrine and planning. The future of warfare, everyone believed, was mechanized, armored, and precise. Against this backdrop, the flamethrower seemed like an archaic curiosity, a brutal relic of the First World War. It was slow, dangerous to operate, and horrifyingly indiscriminate. Most generals dismissed it as a weapon of the past, useful only in theory or for specialized engineering tasks. The German army, inheriting lessons from 1918, still maintained units of Flammenwerfertruppen, flame troops, but even within the Wehrmacht, they were viewed as expendable specialists. Their equipment was heavy, their range short, their lives short. When Allied intelligence reported that American engineers were experimenting with portable versions, some in the SS called it a toy weapon, fit for parades, not war. Propaganda reinforced this arrogance. Nazi periodicals boasted of superior German technology, of tanks that could withstand any fire, of fortifications that no gasoline sprayer could breach. To the men of the Waffen-SS, molded in confidence and myth, the flamethrower was a primitive tool, unworthy of modern soldiers. But in quiet workshops across the Atlantic, American ordnance engineers saw something else. Not a toy, but a necessity. In the early 1940s, reports from the Pacific began reaching Washington. U.S. troops in the Philippines and on small island outposts were encountering a new kind of fortification. Caves, pillboxes, and tunnels carved deep into coral rock. Japanese defenders were immune to standard small arms fire. Grenades could not reach them. Artillery shells merely scarred the surface. The enemy, it seemed, was learning to hide inside the earth. Conventional weapons could not smoke them out. Commanders demanded something that could. By 1942, the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, the same organization once responsible for gas weapons, began reimagining the flamethrower. They studied old German and British models, tested new fuels, and experimented with ignition systems that would remain reliable in jungle humidity. The result was the M1 flamethrower, crude, heavy, but functional. It projected burning fuel up to 20 meters, just enough to reach bunker openings. It was a start. In Europe, meanwhile, Allied forces were also confronting the brutal efficiency of German defensive engineering. From the Atlantic Wall to the Siegfried Line, bunkers dotted every strategic position. Concrete, steel doors, and overlapping fields of fire made frontal assaults suicidal. The lessons from both theaters would converge: Pacific necessity and European fortification. In late 1943, as the U.S. Marines prepared for Tarawa, the weapon underwent a rapid evolution. Engineers refined the backpack tanks, improved the pressure regulators, and added an electric ignition system. The new version, the M2 Flamethrower, was lighter, more dependable, and devastatingly effective. Still, skepticism persisted. Many commanders viewed it as cumbersome. Infantrymen hesitated to carry it. The twin tanks made the operator a prime target, and a single bullet could turn him into a walking torch. Yet in the field, the results spoke louder than fear. At Tarawa, Marines using improvised flamethrowers cleared Japanese bunkers that had withstood hours of bombardment. Concrete cracked under the heat. Oxygen vanished inside sealed chambers, and entire garrisons perished within seconds. Those who survived told of an invisible enemy, of a hiss, a roar, and a wall of living fire that consumed everything. The German propaganda machine continued to sneer. Reports from the Pacific were dismissed as island exaggerations. But within military intelligence circles, analysts began to take notice. If such a weapon could clear pillboxes in coral, what might it do to the concrete nests along the Rhine? A silent shift was beginning. The weapon once mocked as a toy was slowly becoming the most feared instrument of close combat. And as production ramped up, thousands of new operators trained, preparing for a kind of warfare where no bunker, no cave, and no fortress would ever feel safe again. By 1944, the flamethrower had become more than an experiment. It was now part of the U.S. Marine Corps' tactical doctrine. Each assault company assigned flame teams trained to operate in pairs. One man carried the twin fuel tanks and the wand, while another guarded him with rifle fire. Their role was not random destruction, but precision annihilation, to root out resistance wherever it hid, in pillboxes, caves, or trenches too deep for grenades. In the Pacific, these men were among the most exposed and the most feared. They advanced under fire, their silhouettes marked by the gleam of metal tanks. To the enemy, they became targets of desperation. To their comrades, they were necessary angels of fire. The conditions of the Pacific demanded such extremes. On the coral atolls of the Gilberts, the Japanese had perfected a network of defense unseen in Europe. Concrete bunkers interlocked beneath palm trees, each opening faced another, designed to create kill zones for approaching Marines. Flamethrowers offered something new, a weapon that could reach around corners, crawl through gun slits, and fill tunnels with fire. At Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, the Marines learned through agony how to use it best. The weapon was heavy, its fuel thick and unstable, but in practiced hands, it became an instrument of surgical devastation. A burst of flame lasted only seconds. Yet in those seconds, the temperature could exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius. Oxygen disappeared, metal warped, human endurance failed. The effect was immediate, and it spread through enemy lines faster than bullets ever could. Through terror. Back in Europe, word of the Pacific results reached Allied high command. Reports described Japanese defenders who would fight to the last man, yet surrender instantly at the sight of a flamethrower. The psychological effect was undeniable by mid-1944 as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy. Engineers began issuing flamethrowers to combat engineers and specialized assault units. The British developed the Lifebuoy flamethrower, so named for its circular fuel tank. The Canadians introduced flame-equipped vehicles, including the Wasp and the fearsome Crocodile variant of the Churchill tank. Germany, once the pioneer of the weapon, now faced its perfected form in enemy hands. Inside Hitler's Atlantic Wall, soldiers still mocked the Allied designs in official briefings. Yet in private diaries and reports, their tone was different. The first encounters with flame tanks during the Normandy campaign shattered any illusions. At Caen and Saint-Lô, German troops trapped in bunkers found themselves facing weapons that could project fire over 100 yards. Even the thickest concrete could not protect them once the flames entered through ventilation shafts or firing slits. For SS units manning these defenses, the shock was profound. The same weapon they had dismissed as a primitive tool was now destroying positions untouched by artillery or bombing. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American innovation reached its grim peak. Engineers began mounting flamethrowers onto Sherman tanks, creating the POA CWS H-1, the so-called Satan or Zippo tanks. These machines spewed burning fuel across hundreds of feet, clearing entire hillsides of resistance. On the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima and the ridges of Okinawa, these armored flamethrowers became indispensable. The Japanese fought from miles of underground tunnels, and only flame could penetrate that darkness. For the Marines, carrying the M2 became a badge of both courage and isolation. Few survived long in the open, yet their presence often decided the battle. By the end of 1944, the flamethrower was no longer a sideshow. It was a weapon that defined the nature of close-quarters warfare. Intimate, horrifying, final. And as the war neared its climax, its next evolution would be not in metal or fuel, but in psychology. For those who faced it, and those who wielded it, the weapon changed what it meant to fight, to kill, and to fear. War is often described in terms of numbers, divisions, tanks, tons of bombs, but the flamethrower reduced combat to its most personal scale. One man against another, only meters apart. The operator was always exposed. He carried nearly 70 pounds of fuel and compressed nitrogen on his back. A walking bomb in the eyes of his comrades. Few volunteered for the job. Those who did were often quiet men, steady under pressure. They needed precision, calm hands, and an acceptance of risk that bordered on fatalism. Marine flamethrower operators spoke later of the silence before the shot, of the moment when they approached a dark opening, knowing there were living men inside. You squeeze the trigger, one veteran recalled, and the world just disappears in flame. For those inside the bunkers, the experience was unspeakable. Survivors from both German and Japanese positions described suffocating heat, the sudden vacuum of oxygen, the walls turning liquid red. Some tried to shoot back. Others simply screamed until the fire took them. The weapon erased the distance that modern war had created. It forced soldiers to confront the human cost face to face, not through a scope, not by artillery coordinates, but directly, in fire and breath. The flamethrower was simple in principle, complex in danger, a pair of pressurized tanks, one for fuel, one for nitrogen, a wand with a trigger valve, a small ignition system at the muzzle. When fired, compressed gas forced the fuel through the hose, atomizing it into a stream of liquid fire. The US M2 model could project this stream up to 40 yards. Its thickened fuel, often gasoline mixed with napalm or rubber, allowed it to cling to surfaces and burn longer. Engineers adjusted nozzle designs to control range and spread, seeking a balance between safety and power. But reliability came at a price. The operator's exposed posture and the weapon's limited ammunition, usually enough for just a few bursts of 2 to 3 seconds each, made it a one-shot instrument. After that, the gunner either withdrew or faced death. In comparison, the German Flammenwerfer 41 offered slightly greater range but suffered from fragility. Its ignition system was prone to failure, and cold weather could freeze its fuel lines. The British Lifebuoy had better protection for its tanks, but weighed almost 70 pounds, an exhausting burden under fire. Despite these differences, all shared the same fundamental purpose: to turn confined space into lethal chaos. Few weapons in the Second World War carried such an aura of terror. The flamethrower's effect on morale was as decisive as its physical destruction. Soldiers feared it instinctively. Fire triggered a primal reaction, bypassing discipline and training. Units that would never surrender to bullets or shells often broke at the sight of a flame operator advancing. Reports from both theaters reveal this pattern. Japanese defenders, famed for suicidal resistance, occasionally emerged from their bunkers waving white cloths rather than face the flame. German prisoners described being burned from the inside out, not physically, but mentally, by the knowledge that concrete could no longer save them. Even among Allied troops, the weapon carried moral weight. Some called it inhuman, others necessary. The Geneva Conventions did not specifically ban flamethrowers, but commanders recognized their psychological impact could border on terror warfare. The men who used them often suffered for it. Many flamethrower operators reported nightmares long after the war, of fire that wouldn't stop burning, of voices screaming behind sealed doors. And yet, on the battlefield, it worked. No other infantry weapon could achieve such total suppression, such immediate dominance. The power of flame was not only in its heat, but in what it represented. A force beyond control, a return to ancient fear amid the machinery of modern war. By the middle of 1944, these three forces, human resolve, mechanical ingenuity, and psychological dread, had fused into one doctrine. The flamethrower was no longer an auxiliary tool. It was a weapon of choice for the harshest tasks. The clearing of bunkers, caves, and fortified ruins where courage alone was not enough. And as its flames spread across both hemispheres, another set of lessons emerged, from tactics, leadership, and the enemy's own changing perception of the weapon they once ridiculed. By 1945, the flamethrower had become a weapon of precision, the spear point of infantry assault. Marines and soldiers learned that fire alone could not win ground. It had to be coordinated. The standard attack sequence became known as flame and move. Riflemen and machine gunners laid down suppressive fire, while the flamethrower operator advanced under cover. When close enough, he unleashed a burst into the bunker opening, then pulled back as others rushed in to secure it. Each burst lasted only a second or two, yet that second often ended a strong point that had resisted hours of shelling. The weapon turned the geometry of defense against itself. Gun slits became funnels, tunnels became ovens. On Okinawa's Shuri line, Marines used the M2 in combination with demolition charges. One squad would burn the entrance, another would seal it with explosives, trapping what remained inside. The grim efficiency shocked even hardened veterans. "You didn't take a position," one recalled. "You erased it." In Europe, British and Canadian forces refined similar methods using crocodile flame tanks. The tanks advanced with infantry behind them, their armored hulls deflecting incoming fire while the projector blasted enemy bunkers from a safe distance. One burst from a crocodile could clear a trench 150 yards long. The tactical lesson was unmistakable. No defense could withstand direct fire if oxygen itself became a weapon. For those inside the fortifications, the experience of facing a flamethrower was apocalyptic. Japanese soldiers who survived such attacks described unbearable heat, thick smoke, and the suffocating roar that filled every inch of space. Concrete walls radiated with trapped heat, turning bunkers into sealed furnaces. It was like the world itself was burning, one Japanese private later wrote from captivity. German reports were just as stark. Units along the Siegfried Line began requesting additional ventilation and secondary exits once they witnessed Allied flamethrower assaults. SS training manuals, which once dismissed the weapon, were revised in early 1945 to warn troops of its effects. Do not remain in enclosed positions. Escape immediately upon sight of flame. Captured documents revealed a psychological collapse within some fortified units. The very weapon they had scorned now inspired panic. At Aachen and Hürtgen Forest, German defenders often abandoned positions untouched by artillery, merely from rumors that the fire troops were approaching. Propaganda could no longer hide the truth. Soldiers wrote home in dread of being burned alive in our own bunkers. To many, it symbolized the turning tide of the war. Germany, once the master of mechanized terror, now helpless against primitive, consuming flame. Commanders on both sides grappled with the moral and practical weight of fire. For the Allies, its value was undeniable. Generals like Holland Smith and Simon Bolivar Buckner on Okinawa recognized that no other weapon could root out defenders so deeply entrenched. But they also understood its psychological toll on their men. Orders emphasized restraint. Use only against confirmed enemy positions, never on civilians, and cease once resistance ended. Still, battlefield reality rarely allowed such control. In the chaos of close combat, fear and vengeance blurred boundaries. Units sometimes used flame where grenades would have sufficed. Not out of necessity, but fury. The line between strategy and punishment grew thin. Among German officers, the shift from contempt to desperation was swift. Reports to Berlin begged for better countermeasures: sand, water barrels, or mobile extinguishers, but none proved effective. The SS leadership, once proud of invulnerability, found itself facing a weapon that ignored fortification logic entirely. Even Japanese commanders, who prized death before surrender, recognized the futility. Orders from Tokyo instructed island garrisons to dig deeper, to connect caves with tunnels, but fire found them all. Leadership had to adapt not just tactically, but morally. In both theaters, the flamethrower forced men to confront the limits of discipline, the meaning of necessity, and the unbearable intimacy of modern killing. By the war's final year, every army that had once dismissed the flamethrower had been reshaped by it, tactically, emotionally, and spiritually. The laughter that once greeted its arrival had long turned to dread, and in 1945, as Allied forces closed in on the last bastions of the Axis, that dread would reach its peak. In two campaigns that burned themselves into the memory of history, Iwo Jima in the Pacific and the collapsing fortresses of Germany in Europe. Iwo Jima, February 1945. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, riddled with tunnels and concrete bunkers. From the air, it looked lifeless. From the ground, it was hell. When the first waves of U.S. Marines came ashore, they faced an enemy they could not see. The Japanese had transformed the island into a labyrinth. 11 miles of interconnected caves and gun positions. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery fired from invisible slits in the mountainside. Every approach was a death trap. For 3 days, the Americans bombarded the island with naval shells and rockets. When the smoke cleared, nothing seemed to move. But beneath the surface, tens of thousands of defenders waited. The assault on Iwo Jima would show the world what the flamethrower was truly capable of, and what it did to those who used it. Marines advancing toward Mount Suribachi found that conventional weapons could not clear the caves. Grenades exploded harmlessly in deep shafts. Rifle fire was useless against stone. Every position taken in daylight was reoccupied by night. Then came the flame teams. Carrying their M2s, they crawled through ash and sand toward dark openings. A spotter pointed out the vents. The gunner knelt, squeezed the trigger, and the cave mouth erupted. The liquid fire flowed like water. It clung to the rock, filled the air with thick black smoke, and sucked the oxygen out of every crevice. Screams echoed briefly, then vanished under the roar. One Marine corporal recalled, "You didn't see the enemy. You heard him burn." The tactic became systematic. Burn. Seal. Move forward. By the battle's end, nearly every Japanese position on Iwo Jima had been destroyed by flame. Even those who tried to surrender often emerged too late, burned beyond recognition. The psychological impact was devastating. American officers reported Japanese troops committing suicide rather than face capture by flamethrower. Entire tunnels were found filled with charred rifles, melted helmets, and the remains of men who had chosen self-destruction over fire. For the Marines, victory came at a cost. Flame operators suffered some of the highest casualty rates of the war. They were prime targets. One bullet to the tank could ignite the operator instantly. Yet they went forward, again and again, because the battle demanded it. The flamethrower had proven itself not as a weapon of spectacle, but of grim necessity. It was the only tool that could penetrate the earth itself, the only answer to an enemy who refused to surrender. In military reports after the battle, commanders wrote that the weapon had saved thousands of American lives at the expense of human horror. The phrase captured the paradox perfectly. Iwo Jima was not merely a triumph of tactics. It was a revelation that in modern war, technology could revive the most ancient forms of fear. The images of flame sweeping across the island, of bunkers turned into burning tombs, would soon reach the newspapers back home. Civilians called it barbaric. Soldiers called it survival. But the battle was not yet the end. Across the Pacific, one more island awaited, Okinawa. And there, the weapon's full psychological power would be unleashed. While the Pacific burned, Europe smoldered under its own storm. Spring 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Yet, from the Rhineland to the Alps, Germany's final defense lines still bristled with concrete bunkers and fanatical SS garrisons. They called them Festungen, fortresses, meant to hold back the inevitable. Against these positions, the Allies brought everything: artillery, tanks, and now fire. On the Western Front, British and Canadian troops employed the Churchill Crocodile, perhaps the most terrifying flamethrower vehicle ever built. A thick armored tank towing a fuel trailer, its projector could fire a jet of burning liquid over 120 yards. The Crocodile rolled forward with a quiet mechanical hum until its operator pulled the trigger. Then the world ignited. German soldiers watching from bunkers described the first burst as a river of fire. Concrete, once a shield, became an oven. Those not killed by the flame suffocated as the heat devoured the air. At Caen, Boulogne, and later at the Siegfried Line, these tanks reduced fortified lines that artillery could not break. The effect was so shocking that German soldiers often fled their positions without waiting for impact. Prisoners captured afterward were found in tears, whispering that the British were burning the world alive. In one after-action report, a Canadian officer wrote, "Resistance ended not by destruction, but by fear. For the Waffen-SS, the elite who once mocked such weapons as crude, it was humiliation in its purest form." Their vaunted fortresses, built with mathematical precision, offered no defense against liquid fire. Bunkers that could resist a direct shell hit now turned into death chambers under a single burst of flame. In the Ruhr pocket, an SS battalion stationed in a concrete redoubt refused to surrender until the crocodiles arrived. Within minutes, white flags emerged from every opening. Survivors described seeing comrades melt into the walls, the stench of fuel and flesh merging in the air. "We had believed ourselves protected," one captured sergeant later told interrogators, "but the fire came inside our lungs." Meanwhile, in the shattered streets of Berlin, flamethrowers made their final appearance. Soviet assault groups, the Sturmoviki, carried compact ROX 3 flamethrowers into apartment buildings and subway tunnels. Their effect mirrored what the Germans had once inflicted across Europe. Walls of flame-cleansing resistance, room by room. The weapon had come full circle, from German invention to German nightmare. By April 1945, the flamethrower symbolized more than military dominance. It embodied the collapse of myth. The same SS divisions that had ridiculed Allied toy weapons in 1940 now faced extinction by them. Civilians, watching from ruined towns, saw in those firebursts the final unraveling of the Reich's illusion of invincibility. No bunker, no ideology, no fanatic oath could withstand the chemistry of fear. Across both hemispheres, on volcanic islands and European plains, the flamethrower had proven that in war, power was not measured in steel thickness or range, but in terror. And as silence fell over the battlefields of 1945, the world began to count the cost. In lives, in conscience, and in the charred ruins of human invention. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the flames lingered. The world had witnessed a weapon that seemed to cross the boundary between combat and cruelty. The statistics were staggering. In the Pacific alone, over 60% of Japanese defensive positions destroyed during the final island campaigns had been cleared by flamethrowers or flame tanks. On Okinawa, U.S. Marines estimated that more than 10,000 enemy soldiers died by fire. In Europe, Allied engineering units recorded hundreds of fortifications neutralized with a single burst from a crocodile or lifebuoy. For the first time, commanders admitted that psychological shock, not mechanical damage, had become the decisive factor in breaking resistance. But with victory came reflection. Footage captured by war correspondents revealed what the battlefield reports could not. The human aftermath. Bunkers still smoking days after combat. Bodies fused to concrete. And the haunted expressions of flamethrower operators returning from missions. The public reaction was complex. Some celebrated the flamethrower as a tool of victory, a weapon that had saved lives by ending hopeless battles faster. Others recoiled from its imagery. Newspapers called it the cruelest weapon of the war. Editorials questioned whether civilization had advanced at all since the firestorms of the Middle Ages. Within military circles, debates began almost immediately. Could such a weapon coexist with modern ethics? The Geneva Conventions did not yet forbid flamethrowers, but discussions emerged about limiting their use in populated areas. Even some generals who had relied on them most began to speak uneasily. Lieutenant General Simon Buckner, killed during Okinawa, had once remarked, "We use fire because we must, but God help us for what it makes of men." Among the veterans, silence replaced rhetoric. Many flamethrower operators returned home carrying physical scars, burns from backdrafts, damaged lungs from fumes, and mental ones that words could not reach. Few spoke openly about what they had done. For the survivors of those on the receiving end, the memory was just as enduring. Japanese war cemeteries listed thousands simply as missing in the caves. German post-war memoirs mentioned Feuertod, death by fire, with a kind of grim fatalism. In museums today, the flamethrower sits behind glass, cold and inert. Yet in 1945, it represented the absolute convergence of technology and terror. A reminder that industrial warfare could still find new ways to return to the most primitive forms of killing. The victory it helped secure was real, but so was the question it left behind. If such weapons were necessary, what did that say about the world they were meant to defend? In the decades that followed, the flamethrower's legacy became a shadow that stretched across military doctrine and moral philosophy alike. By the early 1950s, as new conflicts emerged in Korea and later in Vietnam, the weapon was refined but never fully redeemed. American M2 models continued to serve, their reach extended, their tanks lightened, but the stigma had grown heavier. Soldiers in Korea described the same effect their fathers had seen in the Pacific. Once the flame erupted, resistance crumbled, but behind every tactical success came the same sense of unease. Television, now entering homes worldwide, changed everything. For the first time, civilians could see war in motion. The searing imagery of napalm strikes and burning jungles, fire turned from close range to aerial scale, made the old handheld flamethrowers seem almost archaic. Yet they were part of the same lineage. Fire as domination, fire as a message, fire as the ancient terror modern armies could never quite abandon. By the 1970s, the flamethrower was phased out from most Western arsenals. The U.S. military formally retired it in 1978, acknowledging that its psychological and humanitarian costs outweighed its tactical value. The Soviet Union kept it longer, adapting the concept into rocket-propelled thermobaric systems, distant descendants of the man-portable flame guns that once roared in the Pacific caves. Even as the technology evolved, the lesson endured. Infantry could clear bunkers with explosives, with gas, with drones, but no method ever replaced the raw, final certainty of fire. It consumed everything. It left no room for ambiguity. In memorials from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, names of flamethrower operators are etched among the fallen. They are rarely singled out, their stories seldom told. Yet without them, many island campaigns would have dragged on for weeks longer. The cost of their work is measured not in numbers, but in the moral scars that shaped post-war warfare itself. Modern conventions now restrict the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations. Yet loopholes remain, and the image of fire on the battlefield still haunts the edges of conflict zones. In an era of precision and automation, the idea of a man carrying fire on his back, turning it by hand upon another human being, feels like an echo from a darker, unfiltered past. The SS soldiers who once mocked those toy weapons had witnessed the future without realizing it. They had laughed at the sight of small tanks and hoses, until the first burst of flame swallowed their fortifications whole. That laughter died with them, buried in the blackened tunnels of Europe's last days. The flamethrower was never a symbol of glory. It was a symbol of necessity, and of the point where necessity crosses into horror. And that is where its story ends. Not in triumph, not in shame, but in the uneasy silence of history, where men discovered that even in the age of machines, the oldest weapon of all was still fire. Fire. It was humanity's first weapon, and its first teacher. In the Stone Age, it gave warmth and safety. In the Age of Empires, it raised cities and shaped myths. And in the Second World War, the most mechanized, calculated conflict in human history, it returned, raw and primal, to remind mankind of what had never really changed. The flamethrower was more than a weapon. It was a mirror. It showed soldiers not only what they could do, but what they were capable of becoming. Behind every burst of fire was a human hand, trembling, determined, terrified. The weapon did not choose its cruelty. Men did. In the post-war decades, when veterans spoke quietly about their service, few ever mentioned flamethrowers. It was not shame, it was the silence of understanding. They had seen the line between survival and destruction blur into a single blinding moment of heat. Historians now study it as a technological artifact, engineers as a tool of battlefield innovation. But beneath the steel, the tanks, and the hoses lies something older, a truth that no evolution of warfare can erase. That, for all the progress, strategy, and machines, war remains a contest of human will, bound by the same fears that haunted our ancestors around the first campfires. The SS soldiers who mocked those early American flamethrowers saw only weakness. What they failed to see was the lesson hidden inside the flame, that in war, the smallest spark can consume empires. As the smoke of that era settled and the world rebuilt itself, the fire still burned, not in the jungles or bunkers, but in memory, a reminder of what happens when necessity and horror share the same flame. Because long after the last flamethrower was retired and the last bunker sealed, one truth remained unburned, that in every age, When war strips away its armor of ideology and invention, mankind always finds its way back to fire.